Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Asiatic Society of Mumbai's 32nd Srimati Nabadurga Banerji Endowment Lecture on the topic Radio Academies, Public Concerts and the Staging of Modern Indian Classical Music by Professor Lakshmi Subramanian. For better quality of audio and video, please mute yourself and stop your video. Over to you, Minal.
So, once again, a very good evening to everyone. As chairperson of the Endowment Lectures Committee of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, it is my privilege to welcome you to the 32nd Nabadurga Banerji Endowment Lecture. Today, we are honored that Professor Lakshmi Subramaniam, visiting professor at BITS Pilani, Goa, has consented to deliver a lecture on radio, academies, public concerts, and the staging of modern Indian classical music, a case for new socio-aesthetic categories. We also have the honor of having with us Professor G. Arunima, Director, Kerala Council of Historical Research, to preside. I thank our two outstanding scholars for having accepted our invitation to speak at this lecture. We look forward to an interesting discussion. Thank you for being with us. Before I hand over the proceedings to Dr. Arunima, I would like to tell the audience briefly about this endowment and also introduce our speakers to tell you about their academic and professional background. So, the Nabadurga Banerji Endowment Lecture was instituted in 1991 by Dr. A.K. Banerji, an eminent economist who was then a vice president of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, in the memory of his mother, the late Srimati Nabadurga Banerji. The intent was to discuss any aspect of Indian history and culture. Also, it had to be delivered by an outstanding woman scholar. Dr. Banerji believed that such lectures were essential for an institution of learning such as ours in order to attract intellectuals and to maintain a scholarly atmosphere. Moreover, he felt the need to highlight the contribution of women scholars to various academic disciplines, since that would be a fitting tribute to his mother, who had faith in women's education. These lectures would serve the purpose of assembling scholars in different areas of knowledge at the Asiatic Society of Mumbai. The Nabadurga Banerji Endowment Lecture was one of the earliest of the endowment lectures that was established in our society. The support of Dr. A.K. Banerji, who passed away in 2012, and his wife, Srimati Usha Banerji, who sadly passed away just 2 years ago in 2020, to this lecture series has been immensely valuable, and we are grateful to them for it. To date, 31 lectures have been delivered by renowned women scholars, including, to name just a few, Dr. Suma Chitnis, Dr. Romila Thapar, Dr. Kapila Vatsan, and Professor Anne Fenthouse. To tell you a little about Dr. Lakshmi Subramaniam, she has had a long and distinguished teaching and research career. Currently, she is visiting professor, Humanities and Social Sciences at BITS Pilani, Goa. Her research expertise includes maritime history, social and economic history of modern India, and a social history of Indian music in the 20th century. Her publications include Medieval Seafarers, 1999, and The Sovereign and the Pirate Ordering Maritime Subjects in India, in India's Western Littoral, 2017. In terms of research and specialized interest, Dr. Subramaniam has been able to carve out an important field of India's cultural history, especially relating to music and performance in the 19th and 20th centuries. She has written extensively on this subject and continues to explore new ways of understanding the challenges of writing and archiving music history. To mention just some of the titles of her books, not all of them, I cannot, there are too many, from the Tanjore Court to the Madras Music Academy, A Social History of Music in South India, 2006. New Mansions for Music, Performance, Pedagogy and Criticism, Vinay Dhanamal, The Making of a Legend, 2008, when Amal was a highly accomplished Carnatic musician and the torchbearer of the School of Carnatic Music that goes by her name. Dr. Subramaniam's most recent publication is on Gandhi and the idea of sonic nationalism, Singing Gandhi's India, Music and Sonic Nationalism. It is the first ever and only detailed account of Gandhi and music in India, and some of us were fortunate to have heard her deliver this lecture in person at Mani Bhavan almost exactly 2 years ago, just before the pandemic struck. Dr. Subramaniam has also curated an exhibition titled The Scholar Musician and the Seni Ustads, based on a collection of private papers acquired by the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. The exhibition showcased, among other things, the potential that small private collections have in developing the emergent field of public humanities in India. So we have a very distinguished scholar speaking for our society today. Thank you once again, Dr. Subramaniam, for being with us for this prestigious lecture. I will now I have the pleasure of introducing Professor G. Arunima. She is a professor at the Center for Women's Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and is at present the director of the Kerala Council for Historical Research in Trivandrum, Kerala. She has researched and published widely on both the historical and the contemporary context of India, focusing particularly on cultural, visual, and material texts, and rethinking the politics of the contemporary. Thematically, her areas of historical research interests can be divided into the study of family and kinship, different aspects of aesthetics and modernities, visual culture and theory, and religion and faith practices. She has recently begun new research on urban geographies in Kerala. Currently, she is completing a monograph on the cultural history of Kerala, bringing together questions of gender, caste, and power, and ways of rethinking the social. Her research on different areas of contemporary politics has focused on a range of themes: food cultures, community identities, contemporary histories of violence and resistance, higher education, and different aspects of theorizing gender-based rights. Large parts of these have been presented in both academic and other venues, and some of it has been published. She is the author of There Comes Papa, Colonialism and the Transformation of Matrimony in Kerala, Malabar, 1850 to 1940, 2003, and has translated from the Malayalam Rosie Thomas's biography of her husband, the iconic left-wing playwright C.J. Thomas. He, My Beloved C.J., published in 2018. She has an edited volume of essays, which is forthcoming in November 2021. Maybe it's already been released, she has co-edited with Patricia Hayes and Premesh Lalu, Love and Revolution in the 20th Century, Colonial and Post-Colonial Work. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Arunima. It's now over to you. We look forward to a stimulating session. I think you need to unmute yourself. You're on mute. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shivsagar. May I call upon Professor Lakshmi Subramaniam to actually deliver her lecture so that we can go straight into the lecture and have discussions after that. I think I'm supposed to take a few minutes after that and respond to the lecture, and then it will be open for discussion. Over to you, Lakshmi.
Okay, thanks, Tanu. Thank you to the organizers for having given me this opportunity to speak and share some of my ongoing research concerns. It is a privilege for me to be able to deliver this endowment lecture in the memory of a very esteemed individual. I use today's occasion to share with you some of my ongoing research on the social history and the public life of Indian classical music in the years after independence. Some of you may know that I've been working on the social history of music, how music was staged as a classical tradition and a concert practice. This came out sometime in the 2000s, and I, along with a number of very senior music historians, were able to sort of put the social history of Indian music on the map of historical research. I do something quite differently today. I wish to look more critically into the decades after independence, particularly in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I try and look at some of the institutional initiatives that came alongside the nation state in looking at the larger responsibility of protecting, patronizing, safeguarding music and its traditions, but also in the process generating socio-aesthetic categories. I do this for two reasons. I do this because I think the contemporary history of music in its institutional context has not been adequately studied. But I also do this because I think in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, keeping in alignment with the elements of Nehruvian discourse, there was a slightly different perspective where the region became more important than the national imaginary. So I think that when we look at developments, or when we look at the ways in which music history is being studied, music is being represented, the region becomes very, very important. And this is evident in the way in which certain radio stations function and generate a number of very interesting social and aesthetic categories. I also wish to examine the discourse that emerges in the post-independence period, which I find vacillating between an uncritical, and facile use of categories such as tradition, parampara, canonical, shastra, or scientific modern as adhunik. So you have this vacillation between these categories, and in between, you also have very sensitive, empathetic conversations initiated by both individual practitioners and scholar musicians who made use of their location to disseminate their personal understanding of music. So this is a period when we actually see the flowering of what I would call personal musicology. And how does that personal musicology sort of set up a conversation with the more institution-based categories that are generated? So this is something that I'm interested in doing. And so this address really looks at some of the new discursive elements in the history of music and some of the new indexical markers of this discourse, which I feel can be studied along with other indexical markers in the larger Nehruvian discourse of modernity. One such marker for me, which sort of popped out every time I looked at the material, and I'll tell you the kind of material that I've been looking at for this, was the figure of the expert. The expert was very important in Nehruvian India, whether it was the expert engineer, whether it was the expert construction person, whether it was somebody involved in designing furnaces, or the figure of the expert becomes very important. And I wanted to know whether we could see this figure as a potential lens to understand the multiple ways in which the votaries and performers and publicists of classical music grappled with the challenges in independent India. The expert, of course, came in several forms. It could be in the form of the scholar musician, of whom there were quite a few. It could be the failing, in North India, the failing ustad with his invaluable repertoire, of the cocksure critic who attended every single concert in the Carnatic circuit and seemed to know everything more than anyone else. It could be senior music practitioners who were part of expert committees in important academies like the Madras Music Academy or the Sangeet Natak Academy. And it could also be, and in fact, more often than not, the expert bureaucrat who dominated the audition process in the radio bureaucracy. So the expert, I felt, looking at the idea of the expert, I felt carefully would give us a sense of the ways in which a discourse for classical music, both in the North and the South, was being navigated. And I sort of suggest in the end that in spite of all these efforts, both institutional and individual, we really could not sustain a layered history of Indian music or indeed of its aesthetic. So why this happened, why this was so, why university departments, music schools, centers could not really generate that kind of layered history is something I shall briefly speculate upon in the very final section of the paper. Now, the paper is broadly divided into three sections. The first will be brief. It's a brief introduction to the legacy that India celebrated in 1947, a legacy that had been put together quite consciously, that involved a standardized, streamlined repertoire for the public concert, and also involved a standardized curriculum for modern institutional transmission. This is particularly palpable in the context of Southern India. And of course, the project of staging this classical music was a very complex one with far-reaching social and sociological implications that I will not go into details here. I'm happy to talk about them in the Q&A section. What I want to do is to actually jump into what the nation had when it was officially born in 1947 and what it intended to safeguard. I begin this section, therefore, with a brief comment from the Indian Listener, which is the organ of the All India Radio, which in its 22nd August 1947 edition carried a feature that provided details of the artists who were relayed, who were commissioned to perform on the occasion of Independence Day celebration. The list is telling, and it sort of gives us a very useful entry point to the legacy that the newly born nation had and which it might wish to develop further. You had Pandit Omkar Nath Thakur, who broadcast the Independence Day celebration with Vande Mataram, the much contested song. You had Hirabai Barodekar, who was held out as a remarkable female vocal musician who was relayed through the Delhi station. You had Sucheta Kripalani and Vijay Lakshmi Pandit singing national songs, while poetry, Urdu and Hindi, were read out by Abdul Asaf Jalandhari and Balkrishna Sharma Naveen, respectively, both senior radio artists and who in fact figure in the Indian Listener right through the 50s. For the moment, if one looked at the list, it would seem that the fiercely contested battle over script, Nagari versus Rekta, over genre, Khayal versus Tumri, over light classical, Mellisai, or classical, which is Shastriya Carnatic song, had abated. And as the nation sort of woke up in unison to cheer its present, celebrate its past, and look to the future. Now, whether this was so is another matter, but I think we could argue that we could see that from this list that an identifiable set of musical practices and genre had been streamlined, had been standardized, and had become fairly familiar, had circulated through a series of reforming initiatives undertaken by both princely courts and the colonial gentry in cities like Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta in particular. Now, alongside the staging of classical music, which involved singularizing a particular tradition and streamlining certain practices, you also had a discourse that was produced, a history that was produced, which predictably drew from a remote classical Hindu past and which downplayed the participation of Muslim ustads, in particular in Northern India. So it was sort of downplayed. The Islamic medieval was somehow, it was uneasy, and therefore it was sort of erased, if not completely, but certainly marginalized for a while. This is particularly true in Northern India. In Southern India, there was a slightly different project at work where caste and gender were the sort of the organizing principles for the new reform project, and you had a sharper divide drawn between what I would call classical Carnatic music and Melisse, or something which would be seen as quote unquote light classical, and which of course inevitably involved the disenfranchising of hereditary women practitioners in particular. Now, all these features, of course, were the staple of music histories that we wrote in the 2000s. And I do want to make the point that this discourse was particularly complicated. So it's not as though it's so clear the binary between the Ustad and the Hindu Shishya, the Hindu disciple, or indeed there were no border crossings between the classical represented predominantly by male musicians or indeed the hereditary women musicians. However, I do want to say that we had this project given to us in 1947, and it remained to be seen whether this particular discourse was going to be maintained. What kind of contours would the project assume now that India had attained independence? Now, what would the new cultural engineers be doing with the rhetorical offensive that had been staged by members of an earlier generation, like, for instance, Paluskar, who were against what they call a degraded singing tradition that had lost its older moorings with the Indic spiritual heritage, and who preferred to foreground the bhajan as the most important genre to be sung, and which of course had big takers, including Gandhi. But I want to say this was not all. There was this rhetorical offensive, and it was of course very sharp in the 40s, but there were equally other strains in the discourse, and these strains came from enthusiasts, amateur musicians, mostly Hindu, who had learned from ustads, deeply valued their priceless tradition, deeply valued the intimacy of talim, of instruction they had enjoyed, and wished to integrate this experience as a pedagogic element into the new India they resided in. So they came up with what I call a personal musicology, deeply personal, all about talim, all about what they felt of the grandmasters they had learned with, but one which also tried to echo the discourse of Nehruvian modernity with the signatures of balancing tradition with modernity, science with art, and most importantly of all, the individual with the larger collective effort. So I say that from 47, what becomes very clear is that the mode of consuming modernity in music was deeply pedagogical. It was about teaching new citizens practices in music, but also practices about looking at the nation's heritage, about inclusivity of approach to generous listening, so that old prejudices and dichotomies of difference were overcome. And I make this point quite advisedly about generous listening, because I feel that for far too long, we've tended to reduce the work of the radio by overemphasizing the work of men like Kelkar, who of course had a distaste for Tawaif music, but the radio was not just Kelkar. And the radio, in fact, comes up with a very interesting agenda as far as disseminating classical music was concerned. So I look at the All India Radio, which is really, for me, an extremely important institution that generates, if not theoretically, socio-aesthetic categories, but certainly is interested in looking at boundaries between classical and light classical, even popular, between classical and devotional, so as to make it an enabling tool for disseminating musical education and taste. So I, in fact, argue that the radio is central to taste production throughout the 50s and 60s, and that while it churned out categories that are evident in the various listening schedules that we have, of vocal, light classical, vocal khayal, Sugam Sangeet. I want to say that these categories enjoyed a certain rationale, and it's something that I'd like to pay a little bit of attention to. Now, I find two tendencies, broadly speaking, mark off the All India Radio project. One is a strong emphasis on acknowledging expertise and identifying experts. And I'll come to this expert in a minute. And two, an insistence on disseminating musical knowledge through the medium of what they call light music. So the expert music, and mostly the Gharanedar Ustad, was responsible for demonstrating the richness of the Gharana, for presenting the unique markers of the Gharana to which he belonged. It was light music that could act as the bridge to reach a wider audience. So Sugam Sangeet and Sangeet Charcha became framing devices for broadcasting schedules. I've had the opportunity of looking at the schedules of the All India Radio, the Indian listener, including the vernacular version, which is Betar Jagat in Bengali and Vanuli in Tamil. And it's quite fascinating to see the way in which the idea of a lighter music was actually put forward. You had several announcements in the Indian listener that talked about the need to overcome prejudice about music. They argued that prejudices were deeply unscientific. In the words of an announcement, and I quote here from 23rd December 1951, a particular program that was prefaced with this long announcement, from science to music, after all, is not such a long step. For music is both a science and an art. There are many who are extremely fond of classical music and others who, though not well initiated, have a liking for it. There is also a third category of people who not only do not much about it, but have a prejudice against it. To remove these prejudices and to familiarize the larger public, the program organized a dialogue. And this was a radio play between Kundan, a prejudiced listener, and a Pandit who espoused traditional music. And this radio play was intended to actually sort of familiarize the listening audience about the importance of music. What's again interesting about this announcement is that they lauded artists who were able to bridge these two domains. And here, Hirabai Barodekar seems to have been specially singled out. So I think this is something which we need to keep in mind about the Sangeet Charcha and Sugam Sangeet. For far too long, we look at them as light classical and classical as though they are two categories that are being fixed and sort of made rigid, but it's not so. Now, I want to say that alongside this kind of broadcasting strategy, the radio was equally sensitive to the importance of protecting the Gharanedar musician. And so there was this balancing act that the radio constantly played for diverse voices. So you had the radio drafting guidelines for recruiting certain kinds of experts within the bureaucracy who would, conduct the audition process for grade A, grade B, grade C artists. You also had the radio commissioning senior musicians, mostly ustads, to sing in the Sangeet Sammelan. And therefore, the resultant corpus that you have of views and ideas is sort of slightly incoherent. You have, on the one hand, a series of eligibility criteria that don't make much sense. You also have a series of really serious consultation with ustads about what kind of signatures a particular gharana has, and there are very specific time slots apportioned for radio lecture demonstration by these ustads. So you have this corpus of views which seems sort of anarchic, but I argue that they are not without value because it reflected a shift from older preoccupations with tradition, authentic, pure Indic tradition, to contemporary concerns of music education and of creating orally sensitive listeners and of democratizing the access to classical music. So this is something that I find reiterated time and again. And this is something which I think is very important, because the boundary between classical and non-classical is actually not overdrawn. The entire preoccupation is about the didactic necessity, shiksha, which is constantly talked about, whether it is Sugam Sangeet or whether it is the Radio Sangeet Sammelan that, that sort of held along with the National Program of Music. Now, I want to add to this particular menu the regional perspective that I think that the radio was also very sensitive to. I think in the search for accessible music to act as a bridge between diverse kinds of music, the regional imaginary was important. Now, we do tend to look at Tamil Nadu because it's here that the politics around language and the politics around music assumed explicit overtones, but Tamil Nadu is not exceptional. I want to say that you have station directors everywhere in southern India, whether it's Vijayawada, which is trying to think about a new Andhra Bani, whether it's Trivandrum, which is trying to talk about popularizing its own saint composer songs, whether it is Madras, which is trying to move away from the so-called classical Carnatic to looking at a Tamil ecosystem of acoustic, which is about the Tamil landscape with its hills and valleys and dales and rivers and coasts. And that is actually given a sonic interpretation by creative station directors. Now, it's deeply unfortunate that we don't have any of the recordings, not because we don't have an archive, but because the radio was so strapped with cash, it was cash strapped, that every tape was overwritten. So in fact, when I went and looked at the archival collection of the All India Radio in Chennai, they said to me that, we've got all this in the inventory, but you can't hear anything because we've just been, it was recorded on top of every tape. So it's a great pity that we completely lose what we've had, except some that the All India Radio chose to publish as its own cassettes. But I do want to make the point that this regional perspective is very important, and the regional perspective then complicates, if you like, the socio-aesthetic categories that associate with music. I do hope at some point I'm able to work out on some of these really creative station directors. In the South, station directors worked very closely with practicing musicians. I'm particularly interested in the Vijayawada radio station, which had an active collaboration between Bulletti and the station director, and some very interesting debates about notation, sargam are actually played through the radio. Now, it's also true of the Punjab, it's also true of the Amritsar radio station, it's also true of the Calcutta radio station, where there is an attempt to foreground the regional imaginary. So the Sant Harivallabh festival gets prominence of place in the Amritsar station, while in Bengal, there is a lot of rancor about neglecting the Vishnupuri tradition, and there is therefore a lot of to and fro that is going on. However, having said all this, I will still have to say that the radio project did not really involve the musicians and practitioners themselves when they tried to think about the audition protocols and the examination system. Is there an echo? Am I audible? I mean, I haven't asked that even once.
No, you're audible, all right. There's someone called Rufus D'Souza. Would you please mute yourself?
Okay. So
maybe the echo is from there. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, no problem. So I just I also want to make this point here that while we have this interesting experiment that's going on with the radio, and there is sort of a to and fro about the regional versus the national, there's a lot of anger, sometimes reservations from regional listeners who felt that the bureaucratic setup was very unimaginative, and that there's a lot of criticism that's going on. But I still want to make the point that the radio encouraged actual performers. Ustads worked very closely with the radio station, and yet they were not really drawn into the larger radio bureaucracy. So this sort of gap, if you like, an old gap that we keep talking about between theory and practice, is very glaringly visible in the history of the radio. I'm not suggesting, however, that the radio did not work as an enabling space for the ustads. In fact, I would argue that ustads worked very closely with station directors and sort of generously shared their expertise in the form of recordings. We have marvelous stories and reminiscences of musicians. I've been reading Velayat Hussain Khan, and it's very clear that they felt the radio to be a real space for intimate socialization. And certainly, retrospectively, these slots where the ustad spoke, or these slots where you had the Sangeet Sarita, which introduced classical music with an ustad as well as with film music, became immensely popular for listeners. So, in fact, if you look at later writers who talk about these Sangeet Sarita programs, it's kind of very fascinating. And this is something that I read for the 70s. And I quote, and Malini Nair quotes this in one of her essays: between the school bus dash and dabba pangs, you heard Shiv Kumar Sharma draw fascinating links between the classical santoor, its Central Asian counterparts, its place in Kashmir Sufi music, and how beautifully it framed Pahadi in Baharo Mera Jeevan, which is a film song from Akhri Khat. You found out how Girija Devi's gurus terrified her into remembering the raga time cycle by warning her that Yaman would arrive disheveled and distressed at her door if she sang it in the morning. Or chanced upon sitar maestro Abdul Halim Jafar Khan point to the delicate shifts in Rag Bilawal in a popular film song chosen for the occasion. So I think this sort of retrospective reflection on what the radio did in sort of carving out a broader listening base, I think is important. However, I will insist that the real casualty was the failure to align the bureaucracy and the experts with the bureaucracy to the actual task of generating an incisive and original practice-based musicology. Although you often would have laments in the radio journals about the loss of tradition, there was really no serious engagement at that level. It sort of remains a bit, shall we say, disconnected. Although the ustads, as I say, do find the radio a very important space. So that brings me to the next important institution in independent India, which I plays a very important role in generating these categories of appreciation, listening, and education, and these are the music academies. Now, as far as music academies are concerned, I look primarily at the Madras Music Academy, which has a much longer history, 1929, and goes on even now, and the later academy, which is the Sangeet Natak Academy of 1951. I want to try and think a little bit about what these academies did for producing or not producing a coherent discourse on the aesthetics of practice. Now, with the Madras Music Academy, built into its structure was the Experts Committee. The Experts Committee functioned from 1929, met for 2 weeks every December, along with concerts. You had lecture demonstrations, but more than the lecture demonstrations, you would have the morning sessions where musicians met, and I mentioned musicians, they met to talk about correct usage, prayoga, correct features of a particular melody, the authentic versions of composition, or debate about multiple versions of compositions they received to try and come to some kind of consensus. I do want to make the point that the experts in the committee of the Madras Music Academy were not publicists, not bureaucrats, but most of the time they were musicians and sometimes musicologists from Northern India as well. For example, Ratan Jhankar plays a very, very important role in many of these experts committee, but I do want to say that they were not unmindful of the overall cultural agenda of the nation state. So you did have also token references to unity in diversity, talked about the points of similarity between prayogas in Carnatic repertoire of ragas and North Indian ragas, and also constantly talked about the importance of a practice and not so much think about the grammar of music. Now, what for me is striking about the Madras Music Academy till the 60s, after that, they don't talk about Lakshya Lakshana at all, practice and theory at all. They prefer to think about how to teach. So from the late 60s, the experts committee is really talking about pedagogy. But coming to the experts committee, I think what I find particularly striking when it comes to the Madras Music Academy is how musicians and performers played an active role, as they always did, but also how they were able to set up a fairly critical debate with other official organs like the All India Radio or later on with the Sangeet Natak Academy. Many of the musicians were quite candid and said that they were appalled by the audition and examination procedures, that the examiners were not experienced, and that you did not really have trained musicians as part of these audition committees. Many of them even said that this whole business of unity and diversity was a bit of a red herring, and whether we needed to do this so self-consciously or whether or not we could allow sort of this regional vibrancy and creativity to be kept intact. So you have a very strong emphasis in the Madras Music Academy about a practice-based musicology, and you had musicians like Venkatramaiah. He's particularly vocal in the 1960s, who talks about a practice-based musicology and really completely jettisons down a top-down theory. Now, for me, this is important, and the fact that you have a practice-based musicology is extremely important. But where there is a reservation and where there is this sort of lag is that this does not quite seem to find expression in the kind of curriculum and pedagogic material that's made available to various university departments. If you look at the curriculum in the university departments, you will find write short notes on a saint composer, write short notes on, something else. But there is absolutely, it's a very dull, dead, mechanical approach to understanding music. And so there is no reflection of these interesting debates that are happening in the realm of practice and in the realm of public debate. They don't enter the curriculum. That's one. Neither do they enter the domain of music criticism that emerges as a genre of writing. Of course, it's been there from the 30s. You've had concert criticism coming from the 30s, but neither does it find expression in that music criticism. Music criticism is almost like a cricket commentary. It would be the musician came dressed in this, he had a bad throat, he needed a big cough lozenge. It's as banal as that. So you start then wondering what happens to this, to these two domains, and why is it that we don't have a connected history of music appreciation? So this is something I'm leaving out there for something that we can talk about perhaps later. Let me come back to the situation in the north, where there are sort of similar developments, but also contrasting developments. In North India, you do not quite have an academy like the Madras Music Academy until the Sangeet Natak, which is set up in 1951, and it's got a broad mandate. It is supposed to oversee cultural activities of independent India. It is supposed to create conditions for supporting the artist, and it's also supposed to oversee the healthy growth of regional artistic traditions. And I will say that the Academy runs a journal, and it's able to enlist the contributions of senior scholars, some musicians. It does organize seminars and performers. It also, generates a wider appreciation of performance, taking theatre, music, and dance together. And it does talk a little bit about how to preserve for later use. So there is, what I will say in the case of the Sangeet Natak, a solid ethnographic project, fairly badly done, a documentation and ethnographic project that is actually never really publicized and put out as a public archive. However, what I will say is that the Sangeet Natak Academy ran a journal, and somehow the journal, as well as its official workshops that enjoyed substantial government patronage, and I have to emphasize this, did persuade scholar musicians to work closely with the academies And there is a real participation with the Sangeet Natak Academy of serious scholar musicians like S.K. Saxena, like Ashok Ranade, or indeed Birendra Kishore Roy Chaudhary, whose papers I actually have had the privilege of looking at. And I think this is very important because the Sangeet Natak enables the crystallization of a kind of personal musicology that I started out, in my introductory comments. So it brings me to scholar musicians and musicology. What kind of personal musicology do these scholar musicians actually represent? I find that it's in the 1960s and 70s that you have, through the Journal of the Sangeet Natak, as well as important initiatives in Hindi, and there is the Sangeet Kala Vihar in Hathras, you have very important contributions to the history of Hindustani music. What is interesting is that almost all of them were informed by the actual direct experience of receiving talim from ustads, as a result of which you find, interestingly, the rhetoric of Hindu music and Hindu musicology considerably downplayed. This is something which I've been looking at very carefully by looking at the material in Hindi as well as the Sangeet Natak Journal. Not to speak of scholars like Birendra Kishore Roy Chaudhary or Suresh Chakraborty, who were so deeply moved by the personal talim they had received from very eminent musicians, sort of the last of the Mohicans, if you will, that they were very critical about the skepticism that earlier musicologists like Bhatkhande or publicists like Paluskar had expressed about the ustads. So what you find in the 60s and 70s is really a fairly undisguised critique of the Bhatkhande agenda. Not what Bhatkhande did as a collector, or indeed of his primers, but the kind of opinions he had about the Muslim ustads actually came in for a lot of criticism in Bangla by Suresh Chakraborty and Birendra Kishore Roy Chaudhary. So it's very interesting that in contrast to earlier sociological reflections on Hindustani music, these scholar musicians were foregrounding the experience of their learning, of their ustads, and made a case for generating an aesthetic around it. And this is evident in the way in which Birendra Kishore Roy Chaudhary, an important scholar musician, located in Gauripur and then after partition moving to Calcutta, celebrated the talim of his Sini masters, shared his notebooks with compositions to a larger fraternity, and in fact even talked about instrument design and so on. We also have S.K. Saxena, who wrote absolutely phenomenally of practitioners and constantly drove home the difference between a sterile musicology in the English language that said nothing and the actual wealth of practice embodied in the ustad's conception. All these men argued that only engaging with these conceptions was the way to learn and listen to the fine art of music, even as they drew their confidence from the nation state and its hallowed academy. So you do have all these men dependent on, or shall we say, working with state institutions, and as well as inserting their own personal experience of the musicology that they actually talked about. So I find this particular conversation very interesting, particularly if one looks at Roy Chaudhary's Sini compositions, Sini Talim, and what he stored in his notebooks, not to speak of how Saxena theorized both Ustadi Talim and actually spoke about sonic immersion or bhava in a manner that was really removed from the older hackneyed conceptions of rasa or Natya Shastra. Here was a man who actually talked about how he felt when he listened and then tried to put it in words and talked about sonic immersion and silence, and that required this fidelity to the note and to the swara. That was the only way you could actually arrive at some kind of understanding of what he called music aesthetic. So there is a lot of writing by Saxena on the three pillars of music, which is raga, swara, bandish, as well as tal. But what is really interesting is the way his language illustrates the experience of the singer and the way the notes come alive in the voice of the singer and how that had to be represented in a completely different language. Saxena also never tired of of chiding the ways in which music criticism had emerged in India. He said it was banal, it was rhetorical, it used categories of purity and authenticity and spirituality without any meaning. And he said it was a shame, he wrote in the 1990s in a later article, that it was a shame that in more than 45 years of independent India, a systematic and sensitive treatment of Indian musical aesthetics or indeed of India's musical history had not been written. That universities, centers had failed to develop real scholarship. That brings me to my last section, which is to speculate why this was so. In the decades after independence, which has been the focus of this session, of this paper, institutions were not indifferent to the richness of the existing tradition or to the project of reform that had been set in motion decades earlier. In fact, institutions like the All India Radio and sponsored academies like the Sangeet Natak Academy were invested in the need to recuperate what had been lost and in giving hereditary practitioners their due. And yet, these did not help in developing a conceptual framework for understanding music and giving it a coherent language that could become part of modern instruction and practice in universities or of general music criticism in the public domain. Instead, there was a parroting of older discursive categories of Shastra, Parampara, of the scientific nature of Indian music, of its Indic textual tradition, and a complete erasure of the Islamic intervention that has found even greater support under the growing right-wing dispensation. One of the reasons for this, I suggest, may be linked to not just the growing right-wing turn in politics after the 90s, but to the general atmosphere bred by the managerial state of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, a point that Srirupa Roy has argued for in her book, Beyond Belief. She looks at documentaries, documentary films, and messaging. Here she argues that not only was the state in its very candid admission of failure, that it had failed, that we couldn't do anything, and cautious optimism in science and technology and technical expertise actively augmented its power. It said all this, but it continuously augmented its power. And it also inculcated in citizens an apathy and mindset that endorsed the state project, believing that the state alone could set the agenda and provide redressal for all the ills. Can we see this sort of mindset in operation as far as the staging and understanding of classical music in the period under review? The provisional answer would be yes. Individual interventions notwithstanding, the faith in official state academies was not balanced by a critique of the way these institutions operated. What this meant on the ground was one, a mindless adoption of bureaucratic procedures, of so-called expert interventions in the cultural project that became increasingly detached from the actuality of practice. And two, the breeding of sycophancy that sought official patronage at the expense of creative interrogations. We can in fact track this in the case of music's public life in modern university departments and centers, where the emphasis was on token concession to documentation and research. Not surprisingly, university music departments rapidly degenerated into mediocre teaching departments that could neither cultivate serious ethnographic research or develop a vernacular idiom of aesthetics and appreciation. Musicology continued to clumsily negotiate with science and Shastra, and occasionally with the complexity of the Indo-Islamic experiment, but could hardly break out of the mold to generate critical appreciation of either the practice or of its history. With the advent of television and of diaspora funding, and subsequently of corporate sponsorship in classical music programs, the terms of discourse changed once more, but that is another story for another occasion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lakshmi. That was outstanding as always. I'm not going to waste anybody's time by repeating everything that you have said. I thought I would just flag a few things which I thought were important. Also, since I've been reading all your work on music, I also find the ways in which it's developing, I find that actually very interesting. So for those people who seen the Madras Music Academy to the Tanjavur Court to Madras Music Academy book. There's also a short and very lovely biography of Veena Dharnamat, which you may want to read, that Lakshmi has written. So I find it actually really interesting, the shift in institutional sites that you're looking at. So the Music Academy as a formation to now looking at the All India Radio. And in that context, let me just pose a couple of things there, because we are also, you're writing at a time when radio's character has changed. So we have FM radio, for example, where you do not find any trace of classical music at all, or even what one would call light music. So is there a way in which one wants to think about the older, however flawed status projects of music appreciation, giving shiksha and so on and so forth, this sort of producing the enlightened listener, however complicated these things might be, there is something there that allowed for a sort of spread of music which originated from classical roots to a much wider listening public, which wasn't only going to be fed a kind of steady diet of mainly Bollywood music. So there's a shift that's happened in, what one might actually think about as ideas about music, a new kind of aesthetic, a sonic sensibility, if one will. So a set of things seem to be happening, which we may want to think about. And when I was listening to you, I mean, I had read the paper earlier, of course, but I was also struck by a different moment. Of course, that's not linked to the radio, but the Spikmake as a kind of inheritor in some senses of this idea that you must take the classical arts, as it were, to the people. So the sense that this is something that the people must have. There must be a learning process. So it doesn't matter whether you're tutored at home or in an education institution with an individual guru, or within a university department or whatever, even if you haven't learned classical music, the public has a right to access to this music. But there are certain there's a grammar to the music, there's a structure to the music, and that must be explained. And I say this as somebody who for decades went for Spikmake concerts because they brought some of the best people, so you had the opportunity to hear that. So there's something interesting about this notion of a larger listening public and the relationship that Indian music in all its wider definition, because I know there are hierarchies between vocal and instrumental and different kinds of instruments. I liked your regional versus national very much. Particularly when I was listening to you, I was thinking about Trivandrum and its great efforts to put Swadhinar on the map, but also, the ways in which, let's say, the hierarchy of instrumentation and how that kind of plays out within this story. It's something that we need to think about, I think, when we talk about this. But let me come finally to what I found one of the most exciting parts of this new direction that your work has taken. I like all of this, of course, which is this idea of the scholar, musician, and musicology. I really like that a lot. I like these figures. where they seem to be transacting between an older world of learning that's structured within our idea of what classical training is about, but at the same time speaking a language which comes from academia in some senses almost. It's not the critic who's speaking about lozenges, but something else. Now the question there that I had, and I really like the examples that you had cited from Saxena, but the question that I had is, how many people actually got to read this? What was the mode of dissemination of this knowledge? So could we think about that too, which is, we are all speaking at a time when there is such a contestation over all forms of knowledge and dissemination. And we are acutely aware of this, which is wildly exciting things might have happened within university departments. Most people had no clue. People may have written really brilliant books. Nobody read them because much of this country doesn't read or write, but even those who read did not have access to those kinds of forms of writing. So and I see this in the context of, because you flagged this issue more than once, that in the changing political kind of context that we are living in at the moment, and we speak about the WhatsApp university all the time, but having said that, there is something about the reach of these things. Whether we agree with whatever they're doing or not is not the issue at stake. The question is, who gets educated in these ways? Through this musicology experiment, should we not be, in a way, the vantage point of this utterly depressing moment that we have is to actually think back at what seems like a slightly more sane time, to think about how many people engaged that. Because I do know that music critics were routinely read by the newspaper reading world. Everybody was known and so on. But, a little bit more about these interesting figures. Thank you so much.
Okay, great questions as ever, Arunima. Forces me to think. I'm going to start bottom up. But before that, can I respond or do I wait?
I think please do.
But I have a small housekeeping announcement, which is, could people start typing in their questions into the chat box? That's actually a far more economical way of using time. And it means that the speaker gets more questions. And if somebody finds it difficult to type, if you use the hand raise option in reactions, if you click on reactions and you'll see the hand raise option, please raise your hand and I will call you.
Okay, as usual, absolutely fabulous reflections, Anu. I don't know whether I can answer everything, but I'm going to try and start with how many people read these men. I think that's a very valid point, because although we are certainly looking at a greater level of democratic dissemination, let's face it, men like Birendra Kishore Roy Chaudhary, the scholar musician in Bengal, or S.K. Saxena are read by a fairly small group. S.K. Saxena also has the advantage of being an English language professor and a philosopher. So he's obviously able to negotiate both language and his own experiential understanding, but is also able to see through a lot more than you would normally attribute somebody writing about music. How many actually read this is a great question. I think not many. I think it remains fairly selective, but I think it is here that we, because I keep flagging the depressing times that we live in, it's very important for us to start thinking about these men and recovering them and putting them forward in some kind of a public history initiative. One of the reasons I did the Scholar Musician exhibition was not just because I had a collection of papers by this scholar musician who wrote with passion, with great empathy, who wanted to do much more but could not, did his own research, had a very interesting collection. But I felt that this was a moment where if I brought it to the public domain in a very simple fashion with images, with a bit of recording and, persuade practicing musicians to take his notebooks and notation and do music for the exhibition, this was one way of being able to tell the world in which we live that there were other kinds of intimacies, misunderstandings, interrogations, but a lot more tolerance. So in many ways, I think that it's very important for us to go back to how to diversify and democratize the reading habits of people. I think this is important. It's not enough for us to say that nobody reads. I think it's very important for us to say that it has to be done. If I were to use your own, how many people were excited about new things that were written in university departments? I think people like you and people like others who translated did make subaltern studies or political philosophers accessible to a larger language speaking public, something that would not have been dreamt of in the 70s. In the 70s and 80s, you had presidency and you had a few colleges that would talk about, progressive history. The Mufassals didn't know very much, but I think that changed. So I do think that it's important for us to keep reminding ourselves of the potential in that status project, but also be conscious of the pitfalls. Let's face it, that status project produced some of the most mediocre departments, whether it was universities or music centers or anything. So I do take your point. I think this is very, very important. And I think I'm not here on a mission, but since one can do very little against the juggernaut of false information and hate that we seem to be living with, I think it's very important for me to keep my mind space clear and to think about the complexities of what happened in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, rather than simply going back to parroting what people have done rather lazily, saying Kerkar was hopeless, Kerkar didn't like the Tawaif, and therefore All India Radio was a failure. It was not. So that's why I try and recover and recoup these institutions in an attempt to look back at a decade which seems to me, with all its flaws, had some potential and had some optimism. I think and that sort of brings me back to your observations on both McKay and the fact that current music does not seem to care very much. I do want to make the caveat that I don't mind Bollywood music. I think Bollywood music is very good. I enjoy it. I don't want it to be my permanent diet. But I do also think that we need to be careful, or not careful, but we need to also appreciate that in its present avatar, Bollywood music has also probably been drawing from global music influences, which are probably quite important. And while they may not be the Sangeet Sarita that I like, or that's my age, but I will give this, that the kind of arrangements, the kind of experiments they do probably do speak to a larger idiom of music. So I don't want to not just be accused of, but I don't want to actually be complicit in the consolidation of a particular aesthetic, which also had its problems. So when we talk about classical aesthetic, I think there are issues, and I think there are issues taken up by people like T. Krishna. So I do want to sort of add that little caveat. But to come back to the point, I think that with Spick McKay also, this intention of trying to make something available is what signals the optimism of that project. However badly done, however, with all the pitfalls, something was done, something turned up. You have somebody like Govind Vidyarthi sitting in the All India radio station in Delhi and trying very hard to translate a Persian text, however badly, trying to figure out the complexity of the history. And look at, that's a far cry from the world I live in now. And I'm not saying that you cannot have alternative understanding of your legacy and of your tradition, but look at the laziness that is involved in the extraordinary technological reach of WhatsApp and the extreme care that one took by listening, collecting, trying to make something. It's like that, what Gandhi talked about, slow reading and slow digesting, all its problems. I think that sort of moment of cautious optimism with rather sterile bureaucratic interventions was what I was trying to get at in course of the paper. But, I really take your reflections with great interest. I am also very curious about the regional. It's not something I can do. I mean, I need another lifetime and I'm far too tired. But I really think that regional radio stations, regional oral geographies that radio stations are creating. Think about Trivandrum, think about the kind of very interesting politics that was played for foregrounding Swadhinkarnar, and then trying to bring other kinds of instruments into the recording session, and then getting mainstream musicians from Madras to endorse the legitimacy of Swadhinkarnar. Very interesting. And I think these things need to be kept in mind. And also, let's face it, Trivandrum, Kerala, particularly Palghat, which is produced probably legion drummers, but Palghat also happens to be one of the most vibrant classical music scenes that we never get talked about. And I think it's time we need to think about the regional. And I personally think that bringing the regional vibrancy back into the cocktail of hatred we have is probably the only alternative we have. I think for far too long we've thought about unity. Let's really go back with a bang to diversity, and I would say diversity of all kinds. So that would be my sort of reflection.
Thank you, Lakshmi. Thank you so much. There is one question from N. Srinivas who asks, do you think T.M. Krishna is making a difference to the presently interested community?
That's an interesting question, Srinivas. I do follow all that T.M. Krishna has been doing. And I do think that what he's doing is very important. I think for one, as a practitioner, he has been able to question the hegemony of not just a concert repertoire, which as a creative artist, you have the right to question. If you want to carry on with it, that's your liberty. But if you feel that that repertoire, that particular format is no longer, it doesn't work for him, I think as an individual artist, he has the right to do so. But more than that, I think he, along with people like Vijay Shiva, actually made very important interventions about copyright, about what musicians can expect in these concert rounds. And he also felt that there was absolutely no engagement with larger social issues. Now, this is not to say that musicians singing on the concert platform has to think about pressing social issues all the time. But to even say that I'm apolitical is actually a political statement. So when T.M. Krishna actually says that all these musicians who say that we don't want to be political, we are completely apolitical, he says it's lazy. And I think that that is something quite important. I also think that T.M. Krishna did some very interesting experiments with the spatial locus of classical music. The fact that he decided to sing in a church, the fact that he decided to sing with women practitioners with very different vocal registers to think about a different aesthetic, I think are fascinating experiments. Will that do anything? I don't know, but I certainly think it will enliven, generate different kinds of interest. And surely music is, of course, a deeply subjective psychological experience of immersion, but music can also be a trigger to think about several things. I mean, if music can be used for revolution, if music can be used for inner reflection, why can't music become, or the kind of reflections he has on music, become a kind of lightning rod to think about other ideas? So I think he will make a difference. I think it certainly makes a difference to me in thinking about the present location of this particular classical form. And I'm not just thinking about classical music in Madras. It's no longer classical music in Madras. It's classical music of the diaspora. It's almost entirely funded by the NRIs. It has a particular, set of investments. It's like a badge of honor. So I think the fact that he says all this certainly makes me, as a deep listener, think more carefully. So I think he will make a difference. The fact that he sticks his neck out and speaks on Dalit matters, takes up Dalit songs and sings in the public, I think does make a difference. I think it made a difference when you had the Carnatic Paddhati used by Christian Dalits to sing in the 1870s, and it made a huge difference to the community. I think it will make a difference. That's sort of speculating, but to me, I think it's important. What he does, I think, is a very important cultural project.
Yes, yesterday, madam. Yesterday,
Right,
in 1957. Hello.
Mr. Sonawale, could I
Yes,
ask
ma'am.
you to please hold on for a second? There's another question here, and
Okay,
I
okay.
will take your question after that. Thank you. So Alak Rai has a question which says, Lakshmi, very evocative topic and his presentation. You dealt the relationship of music traditions, musicology and musical education and the state through the state organizations of AIR and Sangeet Natak Academy, etc. Can this be contrasted with the relationships of literature and the state, though through similar fora, or the relationship of science and the state, the last being much more heavily dependent on state largesse? Has someone looked at this already? What about the diversity in science of different regions?
I think a wonderful question. I think to Alok Rai, I will simply say that I would prefer to contrast the participation and the role of the Sangeet Natak with the Sahitya Academy and the Lalit Kala Academy more than with the sciences, because I don't know. And maybe Madhumita, who is part of the audience, can tell us. She's worked on science in the colonial state and the post-colonial state. But I think one could contrast it rather well with the Sahitya Academy. I think, however, with the Sahitya Academy, the agenda was to construct a literary canon, a national literary canon. So there was a way in which space had to be given to regional literatures, regional dialects, and therefore the tensions of being modern were not so acutely felt in the Sahitya Academy. I think in the case of the Sangeet Natak, you had this constant vacillation between tradition, spirituality, modern creativity, and therefore the discourse tends to be a little vacillating, which is not true of the Lalit Kala, because I think modernism in art is a sort of established premise. For me, that classical music, whether it's north or south, is deeply modern, is evident, but may not be evident to most listeners because it's framed in categories that is seen as devotional. Although I will say, and I didn't sort of use that quote, if you look at the All India Radio journals, they have very interesting discussion about what is devotional music and what is classical music, and the two need not be collapsed into the same. I think this is something which also we need to keep in mind. On the science and the state, of course, it's terribly dependent on state largesse. What it has done to the future of science, whether it's all application-based or original research, is not something I can really say with any level of depth and expertise. But thank you for that question. I think that's actually a very important thing to sort of think about. Anu, maybe the other person can type out the question, then
Mr. Sonawale,
yes, madam. In 1957's Hindi film Bhabhi, I heard one song, Chali Chali Re Meri Patanga Chali Chali Re. You may be aware, and I surprised to hear that song was sang by one French singer. And that was very, because we can't recognize whether he is French or he is Hindi. But he sang this song very nicely. Even Hindi wala also can't recognize this. Chali chali re meri patang chali chali re.
I know that. Yes. Yeah, I know the song very well. Thank you. I had no idea it was sung by a French singer.
Yes,
I will just say kudos to All India Radio for being capacious and getting a French singer to sing a Hindi song. I can't see it happening now. We'll have all kinds of xenophobic utterances. So thank you very much. I think that's a very interesting comment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, madam.
Okay, there are two questions in the chat box, and after that I will take Mangala Siddhesh Pandey, who has raised a hand. So the first question is from James. He says, Lakshmi, I believe that the music conferences in Calcutta and other cities when they began had morning sessions devoted to some kind of seminars or discussions. Is there much information on this?
Yeah, thanks, James. I don't know whether there is much information on this. I know that there were music conferences and there were morning sessions. What kind of discussions, what kind of seminars happened in the 60s and 70s, I'm not sure. I've looked at some of the some ephemera material that you have in the BKRC collection that I spoke about, which talks about him presiding over the seminar, getting Dabir Khan to speak about as the last of the, the Seni masters. He himself talks about Talim, but I can't say that I have too much information on the period that I look at now. What the Sangeet, the ITC Academy does in terms of its morning conferences and seminars, which is a later development, is of course another story, but I can't really give you too much information on that particular aspect.
The next is from Ishan Menon from CSSS, who says, going off of what you said, given today's caste awareness and the baggage that classical music has as a space dominated by the upper caste, is there a movement to make classical music and performing arts in general more accessible?
Well, I think, Ishan, that is probably what some musicians and practitioners are trying to do. I would say that by and large in the performing arts, particularly in dance, I would say there has been more space for not necessarily upper caste, not necessarily Brahmin, but upper caste. So you would have important upper caste dancers dancing and in fact making a claim for an alternative reading of the Sadar tradition, which anyway was constituted by hereditary practitioners who did not belong to Brahmin castes. Regarding classical music, of course it's dominated by upper caste. I don't see a consolidated movement to make this more accessible, but I do see some experiments that are happening. And these experiments, I think, might, if they in fact break the barrier of listening. The question for me is not make it accessible, not just through transmission, but to actually make listening possible. And I'm saying that there was a moment when listening was possible. If you look at Tamil film songs in the 60s and 70s, when you had recognized artists singing for Tamil film songs, whether it's MS or MLV or any of the singers, you had film songs which were very much set within the larger acoustic principles of classical music, and that made it big hits. Now that's gone. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I think if you look at Rahman, who does his own experiment, I think that's pretty dynamic. So I'm not saying that that's the only mode of listening, but I'm saying that there was a conscious way to make listening possible. I'm saying, is there that kind of a conscious way to make listening possible? I really don't think that's happening. And I don't think it's only to do with classical or Carnatic music. I mean, are we really listening? Are we really reading? Are we really critically interrogating anything at all? Are we really interested in what is actually happening to, to the state of music that sort of prevails now? I don't think so. I think, and right now, I speak for Carnatic music. I can't speak for Indian classical music. With the kind of investment by the diaspora, I do not see this kind of this sort of glass ceiling being easily, overtaken. I don't see that, but I may be wrong.
Okay, let's have Mangala Sirdesh Pandey next.
Yeah, thank you. I have an observation to make and then a question. My observation was that talking about regional music in Maharashtra, 50 to 60 years ago, there was this Natya Sangeet, where in the plays, all the musical pieces were based on ragas. That's why people like my father, etc., could recognize all the ragas later on. They would say, this is Vimpalas, this is Madhuvanti, because they remembered a particular song that they had heard. And I thought that this form of regional music did a great service to classical music. This is my observation. My question is this: do you think that we have become more eclectic today? And when you talked about Bhatkande, at that time, there was this watertight compartments, each gharana. And those watertight compartments, the borders have become blurred. Do you think that has enriched music and made it reach out to more people with less of, these quarrels or disagreements between the various gharanas, which were very common in the 80s and 70s?
Okay, you put me in a spot about evaluating whether it's become more richer or poorer. But I'm going to try and answer this. I think what you tell me about Natya Sangeet is very important, Mangala, because this is again one of the modes of listening. The fact that you had Natya Sangeet with lots of raga-based music meant that you had a community of listeners who could identify, who could be cognizant in their own way. And that makes for a robust, democratized listening public. Now, whether or not the boundaries between various gharanas have become blurred and whether that's enriched it or not is a little more difficult to answer. I think the gharanas emerged at a particular time when there was a crisis in terms of patronage. Gharanas were not very old. I mean, if you look at gharana formation, it's really the 19th century. And that's when patronage for music from princely courts goes away, and then you have a tighter control over your cultural resources. But then you taught generously when you had to, and you taught it to mostly with Muslim ustads, you taught it to lots of non-Muslim, Hindu upper caste students. I think it's quite commonplace to, of course, you like to stick to a particular gharana because that's where it's like osmosis. You immerse yourself in it and you get everything that you need, and that's supposed to enrich your music. But you can learn from different teachers. You can learn from multiple teachers. And surely when you are learning songs and compositions from multiple gharanas, I think musically, if you're an advanced student, it can only become enriched. I do believe that if you look at the 60s and 70s, and if you think about vocal music in Maharashtra, where Khayal dominates and you have brilliant musicians, and you also have people like Kumar Gandharv, unto himself. And if you look at Calcutta, Bengal, where instrumental music flowers, think about the sarod and the sitar. These are regional manifestations of what is received and what then is matured out. So I think the question of whether we have become eclectic, I personally think, and this is not a very academic response, I personally think our attention span has become so low that I don't think we listen very carefully anyway. And while I absolutely love YouTube and everything that's downloadable, I think there's also the rigor of a concert going habit of listening to 3 hours carefully, I think is actually gone. So how far we are learning, listening, practicing, I don't know. I don't want to sound as though I'm in some kind of nostalgia trip. Everything was wonderful in the 60s and everything is terrible. But I do think the context has changed very, very fundamentally. And therefore, we probably need to start thinking out of the box if we think it's a worthwhile investment to think about.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah. Very interesting answer.
Could we have Madhumita Majumdar next, because she had raised her hand earlier on? Yeah, please.
Thank you, Arunima.
Hi.
Hi. Lakshmi, thank you so much. First of all, I'm just kind of going to touch upon something you've been saying, but maybe probe a bit more. On the socio-aesthetic categories, when you say a case for new socio-aesthetic categories, of course, you talked about the ways in which these categories took shape, acquired currency in different institutional sites through different pedagogical projects, etc. I'm also thinking that, this is a kind of a more looking at the political context, looking at contextualizing the times when certain categories, whether the regional or the national, etc., acquire certain kinds of force. For example, when we say 60s, 1967 is a kind of almost a very significant watershed in Indian politics, particularly when it comes to the resurgence of regional parties, regional kind of expressions, and so on. Yeah. So is there a way of looking at the shifts in the socio-aesthetic categories that you talk about, the way they are articulated through the radio-driven pedagogical projects, or the institutional, the academies, etc., in the 50s or the late 50s and 60s, as it were? And then can you also mark shifts there too, or is it something difficult to do given the kind of paucity or the problems of the archive? So that was my question. Thank you.
Yeah. It means I have to work for another 6 months that's a really tough but very important question. And whether it actually can be done, I'm not 100% sure, but certainly a question worth asking. I do believe, Madhumita, if we start thinking about regional political context and the shifts that it produces in socio-aesthetic categories, and if you look at 67 with resurgence of regional politics, we'll have to find out how much salience music and categories around it had for these regional formations. In Tamil Nadu, it has, because there is this huge fixation of an autochthonous Tamil music. But I've argued that that doesn't really work, because at the end of the day, even Tamil music, when it has to develop its own categories, when I mean socio-aesthetic categories, I'm talking about form, genre, different ways of thinking about raga, melody, they inevitably fall upon or fall back on expert musicians within the classical format to set tunes to so-called Tamil music. So the project really doesn't take off. In terms of aesthetic categories, I actually find that in the 50s and 60s, there seemed to have been a slightly more open attitude rather than in the 60s. So I will say that if I start looking at the regional shifts, I will have to look at it much more carefully, and I'll have to look at it region by region. So that's one. And of course, in the case of Bengal, classical music is constantly having to position itself against the hegemonic Rabindra Sangeet. And that generates a very, very different set of aesthetic social categories. I think the point that you make, that I could have developed my socio-aesthetic categories, is a well taken criticism. I think when I talk about social aesthetic categories, I have in mind really two things. I'm talking about the ways in which the radio or the academy were trying to make a case for the disciplined listener, and also a case for the listener who could be given a diverse palette of sounds to be able to approach and access classical music. So the categories become pedagogy driven. The categories become, how do you listen more carefully? How do you make it more entertaining? How do you actually, and in that particular project, you have an interesting conversation between seasoned expert musicians and film directors, music directors, popular singers. And that's the kind of category that I was looking at. I think contextualizing the category is a very, very good idea. Between the 50s and 60s, whether there is a shift, I'll have to look at more carefully. My work will always be incomplete because I almost entirely depend on textual material of program schedules and reminiscences of listeners, singers, station directors, station masters. Some of them have interesting biographies and experiences, but never of the music itself. Never of list, there are some, but you don't really have an archive of the kind of sound recordings I would need to be able to really track the kind of shift in categories that you're talking about. But it's a point that it's well taken, your point of departure.
Okay, Rufus D'Souza says the query of Mr. Sonawale is a song that became viral on WhatsApp with the French guy singing recently. I think it brings out the predominance of Bollywood music today as compared to classical music. Anything you want to say to that?
I couldn't agree more, but I also think that classical music has sort of different lives. It's also getting new avatars and new incarnations. And this is perhaps something that we also need to keep in mind. So of course it's dominant. I mean, who would listen? As you know, Arunima said, I mean, FM has nothing. And even when there was an attempt in the 80s to try and bring the golden moments of classical music, be it FM Gold, didn't work, no? It had a very short shelf life. So yes, I can't say anything but say yes.
There are digital platforms though, no, Lakshmi? Like
yeah, absolutely. There are listening platforms. So
Srinivasan says, Lokhidi, Madras Music Academy started first, and surely several academies did follow in the three southern states. What were their motivation in defining the expert, and were they conformist or deviant?
Okay, good question. I think the Madras Music Academy certainly is the dominant academy for Southern India, but several academies follow suit. And I'm particularly interested in the academies that come up in Bangalore. And in fact, more than Kerala and Andhra, where you do not have such a running fight between compositions to be sung in Tamil, Malayalam, Kannada, or it is really in Karnataka, where you have the whole linguistic pride of Kannada songs being foregrounded. So there you have experts committee meeting in the Karnataka Music Sabha, where they are not so much debating about whether the raga is right or not, but whether or not it's important for us to start thinking about the Dasakuta tradition, the Purandaradasa, Kanakadasa, and give it completely different kinds of melodic structure, rather than being stuck by the structure that's given by the Madras Academy. So in fact, if you listen to the Dharwad radio station, the Purandaradasa and the Kanakadasa Krutis are sung in a manner that we as Carnatic music listeners would not be able to identify. So I think there are very interesting local imperatives here with mathas and radio stations playing with that legacy that they have and trying to sort of intervene. I talk about the Madras Music Academy because it's so dominant and it continues to exist. And let me say this, that even the Sangeet Natak Academy or Birendra Kishore or Saxena constantly say, if we have to run a journal, we have to run it like the Journal of the Madras Music Academy. You know, let's face it, 1929 and it's still running. Every single issue is digitized. It's bilingual. You have it in Tamil and you have it in English. It's still now predominantly in Tamil, but the whole thing is digitized and available in the public domain. So, you know, one can be critical of a lot of things it did, but it actually produced an archive of reflections. And I think that's really why I stay with that academy.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Is there any way to, since nobody else seems to have put up their hand or written a question, is there any way one can actually study the history of concerts? Because no, it's tough, is it?
I wish. How does one do it? I mean, I think there are, you know, I don't know. I know I have to answer you like a historian. If I were a historian, I will need to know, do I have concert notices? Do I have ephemera? Who are the sponsors? What kind of funding goes in? Who is called? Are there politics? For instance, I really think the Dover Lane Music Conference should be studied. It's now 40 years and we need to study it. There are controversies. There are controversies about people hijacking this and not allowing younger people to perform. It's become part of some kind of cultural capital. So, you know, there are, but do we then, are we then back to studying the sociology of performance and listening? Or are we actually looking at concerts as a site of generating this practice-driven musical aesthetic? I think that's the question. I really think the only way to do it is to have, to listen to recordings and to actually develop a language along.
Absolutely.
And this is something, and probably this is why we failed. Historians don't work with musicians. Musicians don't work with musicologists. Musicologists won't work with cultural czars. And at the end of the day, we all want to be, devoted to our patrons. And what you then have is this kind of ramshackle project. I mean, that's the way I look at it. Might sound very cynical, but I'll tell you an aside. I don't want to make too much of it. But when I organized that exhibition, which was a digital exhibition of the material that we collected, and it was it was a sliver of life of a particular musician. I think the most interesting thing that happened in that exhibition was inviting practitioners to read the notation books, apply it, and play music as in the loop for my exhibition. I think that really gave me a sense of how to reconstruct an aesthetic that was so influential and that I was able to make an experiment with. And I think that for me actually was the most abiding, impression I had of that particular initiative.
That's really interesting. Any other questions, observations? Anuprita Mogamkar has a question.
Yeah. Good evening. I don't know whether I'll be able to frame my question in the proper way, but then regarding classical music, the period you are studying is probably immediately after independence, and wherein probably people were busy trying to settle in their own life and building a new nation. I think also the dying down of the Guru Shishya Parampara, has it affected this of classical music? Are these the can we think of these factors which led to the how I would say that the classical music is no longer being listened to properly?
Anupita, I think there's a slight misunderstanding.
know.
I'm actually saying that in the 50s and 60s and 70s, classical music actually does very well. But I'm just saying that the context for it changes and new categories are coming in. But I'd like to take you up on the Guru Shishya question that you asked. True that the Guru Shishya Parampara was something which modern initiatives, modern music education initiatives wanted to jettison. They did not want the traditional system to carry on. But in fact, most musicians taught on a one-to-one basis. So even if you did not have the Guru Shishya Parampara with all its trappings that we know of, the idea never died down, and the whole impression that you learn individually, teacher to student in that intimate fashion actually continued. And to be very honest, most in Madras, at least in the Madras University for some time in the 50s and 60s, you had very good musicians as head of the music departments who didn't particularly like running the department, but who all taught their students on a personal basis. So this is what I'm saying. Even there is this disconnect. You do your, I mean, if you look at the examination paper of Madras University in the 60s, it beggars description. I mean, it's really nothing to do with music. It do with write short notes on and write this and write that, and who came first and who came second. They're like multiple choice questions. They're nothing to do really with the kind of serious music instruction that we're talking about. But most of them actually taught students on a one-to-one basis. And let's also face it, the idea of the Guru Shishya mode of teaching, if I might call it that, continues to remain. Even with the e-guru, even with Skype, there's a way in which you are developing a personal relationship with the person who's teaching you. All the sponsored academies of corporate sponsorship, the ITC, Sangeet Research Academy, all have a system of resident gurus and resident shishya. So in many ways, I don't think that particular mode of instruction is actually gone. I just think it's been repackaged and sort of redone. Whether it's good or bad, that's a separate issue. And I think it's a very difficult question to answer whether if we have Guru Shishya Parampara now, whether we can in fact instill the same. I think the context has changed. Everything has changed. We have the mic, for instance. Technology mediates our music. So I think there are too many variables for us to go back to any particular golden age. And that's not really my intention either.
Thank you.
So if there are no more questions, let me just proceed to the end of this event. So on behalf of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, it gives me immense pleasure to thank you, Dr. Subramaniam, for your highly erudite and insightful exposition. The case you have laid out spans a broad swath of history from radio to the present day. There is an amazing depth to your research and its articulation. We enjoy the intellectual rigor and scholarship of your talk. We know that you have made an original contribution to the field of music in India. We are deeply grateful that you have shared some of your knowledge and your thoughts with us today on the occasion of this endowment lecture in the honor of Srimati Nabadurga Banerji. We have been greatly enlightened. It has been an outstanding lecture. Thank you. Our grateful thanks are due to you too, Dr. Arunima. The depth of your knowledge and the scholarship that you have demonstrated today in the reflections you have made have left us feeling content. We have been greatly enriched. We truly appreciate your contribution. As always, we express our gratitude to the late Dr. Arun Banerji and his family. We had with us earlier today the brother of Mrs. Usha Banerji, Mr. Atul Kapadia, and his daughter Hina Kapadia, but I think they have left by now. We are happy that they could join us for the major part of the talk. And of course, we thank the audience for their presence, their curiosity, and their active participation in the discussion. And to our Honorary Secretary, Dr. Usha Vijay Lakshmi, a special thanks for her technical support. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you very
again.
much. Thank you
Thank
all.
you.
Thank you all.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
thank
you.
you very much. And thanks, Anu, for being here as ever.
No, I loved it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank
See you soon. See you soon. Thanks to all of you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.